Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everybody's managed to join okay. I'm Nikki Bardsley. I am the Director of Apprenticeship Operations here at Seetec, and I'm going to be delivering the webinar called Leveraging Your Levy and hopefully how to avoid an apprenticeship levy underspend. There'll be opportunities to ask questions throughout. If you can just pop your questions on the chat panel throughout the presentation, I'll either pick them up at that point or we'll pick them up as we go along. Okay, so what are we going to be covering today? So basically the levy has been with us for over 16 months now, and many employers really are finding it quite challenging to spend their levy. So we'll be looking at some of those potential challenges that people are having in spending their levy and considering strategies that Seetec have put into place, which have aimed to help employers to actually fully spend that levy as much as is feasibly possible. So let's just have a look at some of the challenges that are facing us right now as employers. The Open University recently carried out some analysis on ESFA data, and that analysis actually showed that people are only actually spending 8% of their levy. So there is a staggering 92% underspend in levy funds. We're actually coming to the point now where we will at some point reach the 24-month point. And at the 24-month point, people will actually be paying back levy that they haven't spent from 2017. And that will happen from April 2019. So what are Seetec doing to actually spend their levy? So in the first year of apprenticeships, there's actually been a decline of around 24% in starts. And so it's quite evident now that there's going to be some levy pots that are quite significantly underutilised. And if people haven't started in May 17, well, they've got some challenges ahead of them through to April 19, where we start to actually see a loss of funds. And I think this has meant that many employers now are turning their eyes towards what do I do about fully utilising that levy spend and how do I mobilise quickly. So we're going to try and explore a little bit of that during this webinar. What have Seetec done? Well, Seetec actually designed a leadership and management programme prior to the levy coming in May 17. They started the levy programme in round about July 17 and therefore started to utilise their funds fairly quickly. How did they do that? Well, they recognised that there were talent in the business that actually we wanted to upskill, and therefore we were upskilling using a leadership and management programme. We're actually, April 18 sees us actually using around 79% of our levy pot, but we're still 21% away from that and continue to be around that same level away from that. Some proactive strategies, though, that we've also put in place is we've started to look at who we recruit into the business, and actually do we recruit apprentices directly into the business. And we've done things like recruit into bespoke areas such as governance and risk, and also into different administrative functions. Something else that we're working on currently is a scheme for probation officers in our justice division. We're actually anticipating the approval of the relevant standards quite soon. So therefore, we're actually planning in advance in order to bring that apprenticeship programme into the company as soon as the standard is signed off. What else is then challenging? What else is proving challenging? Well, actually, the drawing down of funds is quite challenging. Fundamentally, we've got an example here of a digital marketer level 3. Now that standard, that funding band is actually £12,000, but that £12,000 is actually split over the length of the programme, plus there's also an additional 20% of that funding band that is taken out for the achievement. So if we think about that from a drawing down the funding perspective, each month we'd be drawing down £500 per learner, roughly. And then at the end of the programme, we would get a payment of around about £2,400. If we actually applied that to a cohort of 10 people, you could actually say that there is potential at risk in July of, whenever that is, 2019, that we would be drawing down around £24,000, but actually over the 17 months we're only drawing down around £5,000 on a monthly basis. So you can see that that's a challenge in itself, actually managing your levy funds based on the way the payment systems work. So given these challenges, how do you go about then maximising your levy spend? So the first thing to consider is your delivery model. Is it fit for purpose? Every organisation's training needs will be very different. Okay, so it's often challenging to find a model that works for you. So whether you want to deliver some training yourself or whether you want to work with external providers. The apprenticeship standards still in development, and also the number of standards that have actually been developed also makes identifying what the training needs are quite tricky. But we'll come back to that further through the presentation. In the first instance, really, I think we need to think about who are you asking to deliver your models? Are you doing it yourself or are you asking others? Now, there's three different types of providers that we can think about here. One is a main or lead provider. So that's somebody that's on the register of apprenticeship training organisations who can work with a variety of employers and offer a range of standards. And a lead provider would also look for where you may need supply chain. There's also a supporting provider. So a supporting provider can't provide everything for you, but they may provide components of an apprenticeship or deliver something that is a particular specialism. You've then got an employer provider. So employers can actually train their own staff, and they can also work with a main provider to actually manage their levy for them. So an employer provider gives some flexibility, and we'll explore what that flexibility looks like. Okay, so first of all, we'll just focus in on the external training provider and how you might work with an external training provider. So if you opt to choose somebody that's external, first of all, that training provider would need to be on the register of approved training providers. And in order to be on the register, they will need to have the required infrastructure in place. So this will include things like managing Ofsted inspections, ESFA requirements, funding rules and audit, as well as data compliance. So a number of different factors to take into account there. There's two different options really when using a training provider. You can actually use multiple training providers, so they could meet different training needs. One training provider isn't always able to meet every single training need, and therefore, as you see on the slide here, you may be managing possibly 3, 4, 5 different training providers across your different training needs. You could also choose a lead provider. Now, a lead provider is likely to have a national infrastructure. They will be managing all of your delivery and all of your training, and they will also be able to look for supply chain for you where you are unable to, or they are unable to deliver your requirements. One of the areas to think about if you're looking at a lead provider is the lead provider must always deliver a substantive amount of your training, and that's in order for them to retain that lead provider status. So if it's ever getting to the point where supply chain are doing more than the lead provider, then the lead provider can't be classed as the lead provider anymore. A lead provider can do a number of different things. Not just delivering your training, but also managing your levy spend, and we'll look at some of those other components as we work through. So, becoming an employer provider. If you opt to become an employer provider, then you will be effectively the lead provider. You will manage all of your relationships with the different training providers, or you will deliver, you may deliver some of the training yourself. If you're going to become an employer provider, you will again be subject to Ofsted, ESFA audit, data compliance and data rules, in the same way as a training provider, an external training provider would need to be. You would also be required to manage your own levy spend. If you are acting as an employer provider, you could also actually become a supporting provider. And I'll be working through some of these examples in a short space of time. As a supporting provider, you could provide components of the training, but ask a lead provider or an external provider to actually take the lead on a large proportion of your courses. One thing that you will need to make sure of is that you have got the required infrastructure in place in order to manage your own training, and you may want to look at a lead provider in order to support you with that. So let's have a look at some working examples, and these are examples of where Seetec are working with particular employers in different circumstances. So the first example, Company X, is working currently with us as a supporting provider. This company, in actual fact, were originally an employer provider, and actually we're going to manage their own levy, we're going to manage their own infrastructure, and we're going to manage all of their own programs. However, they realised that it was fairly complex to do this with regards to the infrastructure, and then have since looked at what can they do from a specialist point of view in order to become a supporting provider. Seetec have worked with the company to identify what training they can do, what training they can be paid for as a supporting provider, and what training as the lead provider we will do. And therefore, how it works now is that Seetec are the lead provider and provide the majority of their training against leadership and management, customer service, and other business-related routes. And the company delivers some of its own technical training, such as performing maintenance operations, where they've already got particular workshops that are set up in order to deliver that training. Seetec does deliver the substantive part of their programmes and has worked with the organisation in order to determine what levy funds can be used for and what levy funds can't be used for. The thing to remember if an employer is a lead provider or a main provider or a supporting provider, they actually can't be making any profit from the apprenticeship scheme, and Seetec have worked with this particular company in order to work that through. The second example is a company who are one of the UK's leading media companies. This company basically identified straight away that they didn't actually want to be an employer provider, but they wanted to get a lead provider in who was going to work through what the requirements were. They did go out to market to select a provider, and they selected Seetec as their lead provider. Once we'd been selected, we did actually do a training needs analysis with the organisation, and we identified where their key training needs were, and we also identified what the starting points were. So in the first instance, the company actually wanted to have a talent programme for their leadership team. So they wanted to develop their top talent in the first instance. What we went on to do was to design a delivery programme which was to existing staff on a leadership and management programme, and they commenced that in September of 2017. They now have rolling cohorts of team leader and operational manager at level 5 throughout the year. So we generally start a cohort at least once a month in one or other of the standards. We then identified that there was the need for further upskilling with the digital marketers in the organisation. Now, these were people with no formal qualification and with the need to develop their skills up to a level 3. And again, there is now a programme that runs on each of their sites relating to digital marketing. They went on then further to expand the programme into junior journalism, which is a fairly recent standard that was signed off. And first of all, they're starting again with existing staff with aspirations to expand into journalism. But then they will be moving into new employees, recruiting employees into the business, because they want to bring more diverse backgrounds into the newsroom, and they will be doing this from spring of 2019. Where are we now? The organisation has over 100 plus apprentices, with the aspirations of having 200 plus by the new year. We've had our first 2 achievers in business administration who will be progressing on to a level 3 this month. And the organisation is looking at future programmes which will support their business needs. Just one thing to note here is that the organisation has committed to a dedicated resource internally who helps to support Seetec externally in order to make sure the programmes run smoothly. So it may be a consideration for any employers on the call that are thinking of those types of models. Okay, so I'm just going to stop there. Give a quick reminder, don't forget to put questions into the chat panel. Nothing really coming through at this moment in time. But if you have any questions, please feel free to do so. Okay, so we've thought about delivery model and who you want to work with. Next thing to think about is what are your training priorities? Some of the things you may want to think about is, do you want to train and recruit new staff first? Do you want to upskill existing employees? And what benefit do you want to get from the apprenticeship programme? So in the first instance, we would look with you at your recruitment needs. Can you think about any apprentices that you could recruit into the business which would replace your normal recruitment patterns? Seetec as a national provider and a number of other providers are able to support you with those recruitment needs, but you would need to check with the organisations that you wish to work with to see if they can support you with that. Secondly then, considering your existing staff. Who do you want to upskill in your existing staff? Do you actually want to use it as a way of recognising talent, as the previous organisation did? Or do you want to upskill underperformers that are not at the required level? Or actually do you want to do both? If you want to do both, then how do you actually message that out into your business? The 2 examples I used before, both have recognised that both strategies are suitable for them, but their starting points were slightly different. So for performing maintenance operations, the organisation recruited new individuals into post because they would always recruit new individuals into those posts and train them. The second organisation wanted to have a talent programme and therefore used it to upskill existing staff initially, but are now looking for new programmes on junior journalism. So sorry for the silence for a minute. I've got a question that's come through and I just wanted to answer it at this point. Does my provider load new apprentices onto the digital account once signed up, or does the employer? Okay, so I'll answer this as much as I know the detail of it. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily get involved fully in the detail of the DAS account, but what would happen is that as an employer, you would need to assign a cohort. So you would need to say, we have these particular apprentices that are going to go on to programme. You can then give your training provider permission to do everything else in the background that's needed, but you would need to raise that initial cohort in the first instance. Your training provider then can manage everything behind the scenes, but they are unable to see anything financially that's happening within your account. So there may be requests that your training provider will ask of you in order for them to report consistently back to you. So I hope that answers the questions, but we will be sending responses to questions back as well. Great, pleased you've got it, thank you. Okay, so how do you make apprenticeship standards work for you? So there's three different components here. Firstly, what standards you choose. This in itself can be quite complex. There are quite a number of standards which we'll run through in a few minutes. But if you're looking for standards, you should use the Institute for Apprenticeships website, and we'll send the link out with the recording later today. You could also actually support in developing new standards. So there are trailblazer groups that are developing new standards, and again, those details can be found on the IFA website. And finally then, working with a training provider to actually adapt existing standards to meet your needs. And then we'll talk about that and give some examples of that shortly. So existing standards, there are over 350 now standards approved for delivery. Standards get approved on a monthly basis, so that's generally going up and up every month. And they're delivered across about 15 routeways. So standards are basically designed relevant to industry, and the standards are very much occupationally focused. They're also developed by employers, so the idea is that they meet the needs of the industry and that they're there to actually develop the relevant skills, knowledge and behaviours relating to certain job roles. Higher and degree apprenticeships are also available, and there's about 80 of those available at this moment in time, but there is a general increase in those, and roughly about 38% of apprenticeships now are level 4 and above. When developing standards, what will happen is that the IFA will apply a funding band to those apprenticeships. Now, there are 30 funding bands, and they range from £2,500 to £27,000, and that's basically the cost of the apprenticeship. Now, the allocation of the funding bands is basically based on the complexity of the standard. It's also based on the cost of delivering that standard, and finally it's based on things like the length of that standard. So developing standards then, these new standards that are in development, there's over 200 of these, basically they are continuing to develop. Trailblazer groups are currently in existence, and there are roughly 10 to 12 employers on each group. They will identify where a new standard is needed and if there's any occupational gaps. But any employers can actually get involved in these Trailblazer groups through the IFA website. So if you identify something as being a gap in the standards that are available at this moment in time, particular job roles that you would be interested in, then please contact the IFA and have a look on their website in the Developing New Apprenticeship section. Training providers also get involved in the development of these new standards, because basically once a standard is being developed, there also needs to be an assessment plan that's designed. So how will that particular standard be assessed? Training providers will support with that. I myself have supported with the assistant accountant apprenticeship, and a colleague of mine, Melanie Nicholson, who's the Director of Excellence and Skills, has also supported and chaired the management standards way back in 2015-16, whenever they were developed. So make sure you check out the IFA website if you feel that there are any standards missing. Okay, don't forget to pop any questions you might have in the chat panel, and I'll come to them at the end of the presentation. So, what about adapting standards then? There are a multitude of standards out there, and so it's not always that easy to actually choose the one that suits you. Some are quite, it's quite obvious what they do. I think there's one called Abattoir Assistant. I think that sort of pretty much says what it does. But it's not always that easy to firstly find something that meets your business need. Secondly, that seems to meet the job roles that you have. Sometimes they include sort of components, learning outcomes that don't seem to be sustainable, that you can't adapt to your job roles. And finally, it might just be that actually you're already delivering training, and you feel that it meets a proportion of the development needs, but actually doesn't meet the full requirements of the apprenticeship. So we're going to look at how standards can be adapted to meet those needs. Now is a really good time to actually look at the flexibility that the standards have within them. Look at how the programme can be contextualised to you and adapt that to your organisation, your organisational need and individuals' needs. So just looking at an example really of how a standard can be adapted to meet a business need. The Business Administrator Level 3 actually is a prime example of this. It was a really, really popular framework, but it was also quite inflexible. It often meant candidates were performing jobs that weren't relevant, that were never part of their job role, and fundamentally they were manufacturing evidence in order to meet the MVQ requirements. The new standard is much more adaptable. It includes learning outcomes that you can adapt to different ways, and it can also include different aspects of your business need. Learning outcomes within it will include things like project management, will include finance, IT, problem solving. There's a significant number of learning outcomes that can be adapted in different ways to you. I think the administrator standard is one of those standards that can be utilised to demonstrate transferable skills and can be used in various administration functions. So, just a few examples of HR coordinator, secretary, project coordinator. There's all sorts of different administration roles that could be suitable. And just to point out here, with this being a level 3 qualification apprenticeship, there will be a requirement that the individual will evidence that they can work autonomously, that they will evidence that they can effectively manage their own time and also the time of others, so potentially supervising people, and also they'll have to show that they are able to make decisions and have those decision-making abilities. So a prime example of this is a Business Administrator Level 3 that Seetec adapted for a multinational law firm in London. So the company identified that there was a business need to upskill secretaries, so legal secretaries. Some of them had been in the firm for quite a long time. Some of them are actually quite new to the company, but there were definite needs for all groups of legal secretaries. So Seetec worked with the firm, first of all, to review which standard was most suitable, and it was identified that the Business Administrator 3 was most suitable. And where were the shortage of skills? So we looked at where skills shortages were, and with the team, the L&D team in the organisation, we reviewed what the highest skills needs were. So first of all, they identified that legal secretaries would need to be managing partners' expenses more, and they weren't used to managing expenses or managing finances. So finance became quite a predominant module within the standard itself and a primary focus. Secondly to that came IT, because there would also be the need to design and develop spreadsheets to quite an advanced level. And therefore, the finance module was given a significant emphasis through the programme. In addition to that, then, they also identified that problem solving and working autonomously were often an issue, and that was also woven into the tuition. And then finally, the organisation also said, well, we've got quite a number of training modules that we automatically deliver. And therefore, they wanted to think about how they could use those training modules. So there were some training modules that really weren't relevant, but there were quite a number that were relevant. There was a couple like making meetings happen, presentation skills, etc., which really did, fundamentally work its way through into the Business Administrator Level 3. And therefore we incorporated that training, which would have happened anyway, but we incorporated it to cover some of the 20% off the job requirements, and also to develop the relevant skills in those areas. The buy-in actually for the programme has been really tremendous. There's 30 secretaries started in September of this year, and they're starting on the first programme. And in short, the firm really feels that they've now got a really bespoke business administrator programme. It's been adapted to their business needs, and it is also meeting their skills shortages and development requirements. Okay, so I'm just going to have a check and see if there are any questions. So there's a question about, I've had my cohort registered since October 2017. How can I see what's left in my account? So you should be able to, from your apprenticeship service account, you should be able to draw down a transaction report. Now, the transaction report will actually show you exactly what you've paid in, and then it will show you what's been spent. And that will give you a good view of exactly how you're going on. There is a piece of work that needs to be done in order to know what you're going to maybe lose from May 19, but basically what you need to do is look at where you are using the first funds up, how much you've used, and then that will enable you to consider where the funds you may lose in May 19. Seetec will actually, we do work with employers to review that, but it's not something necessarily that your digital account will do, and maybe something, if you're working with a lead provider, that you need to ask that lead provider to do. So I'm just checking out a few of these questions, so I haven't gone off anywhere. Okay, so the question is around if somebody's a lead provider and you want to use as a supporting provider, so it's around the procurement process. So basically what the person is asking is, if you wanted to use supply chain as well as the lead provider, should the lead provider actually manage that procurement process for you? That really depends on what you've agreed with your lead provider. So some lead providers will, but if you haven't already agreed that in advance, you may need to have that discussion with them. There are two ways of doing this, excuse me. There are two ways of doing this. One is that an employer can have a lead provider who just delivers the largest proportion of their apprenticeships, and then any additional supply chain is sourced by the employer, or the lead provider can manage the procurement process for the employer. But what you need to bear in mind is that that is above and beyond what the requirements of a lead provider would be, so you do need to make those arrangements separately. Okay. So there may be a couple of other questions that come up, but I just one thing of note that's come up recently, and you may have already heard. So at the Conservative Party conference, Chancellor Philip Hammond has made the announcement that from April 2019, that you will be able to provide your supply chain with 25% of your funding, so that you can support your supply chain. That's changed from being 10% at this moment in time. Now, the details of this are a little sketchy at this moment in time, but presumably the reason that it'll be brought in April 2019 is anybody that's accumulated a significant amount of funds may be able to transfer some of those funds over to their supply chain rather than it being lost altogether. Okay, the other thing Philip Hammond has said is that there will also be an expanding range of courses. Now, given the fact that we've just talked about nearly 600 standards that are either already approved or in development, you know, there's going to be further challenges, I think, that's going to happen from expanding range of courses. But there will obviously also be benefits to that, and giving a better selection and maybe something you know, quite exclusive to you as an organisation. Okay, so just to sum up, and then we'll go to any further questions. So just to sum up, all in all, moral of the story: be careful how you choose your delivery model and who your providers are. Work with your provider very closely to determine what your business needs are, and then look at how best to spend your levy with your training provider or you know, with a team of people within your organisation. And also work with your training provider on looking at how to adapt those standards to actually meet those needs. Seetec are currently working with all the employers that are named on the screen, as well as lots of others. We're already doing these things. If you would like any sort of further details, please visit our website at seetec.co.uk/employers. That's the salesy bit done. So, are there any other questions? Let's just have a look. No, so somebody said, did you say that training providers couldn't make a profit? No, I said employer providers who are acting as a supporting provider, so as supply chain to the training provider, can't make a profit. Training providers would need to make a profit because most of them are not charities. Okay, David said, thank you. He's going to engage with Lee Spicer. So, Steve, heads up there if you're listening. I'm not totally sure, Stuart, what you're asking. How many levy transfers can a single company receive? Let me take that one away because I'm not totally sure of the answer to that one and wouldn't want to give an incorrect answer. So I'll take that away and we'll send responses back to you via email. Joanna, I work with the local government. I noticed you work with Islington. Did they procure you as lead provider? If so, what was the process for this? I can look into what the process was. I would assume they would have had to have gone through procurement, and I would assume that we would have bid for that work and won an ITT based on that. Okay. Okay, so when April comes and we have to pay back the levy, is this an automatic process? Yes, James, it will be an automatic process. So I'd suggest that people are reviewing where they feel they may be underspent because, you know, obviously it will automatically be taken back out of the account. Okay, a couple of other questions then. One being around what levy funds can pay for and what they can't pay for. So levy funds can actually pay for training and assessment, obviously. It must be for an approved apprenticeship programme, and if you are using a training provider, there must be an approved training provider. It can also be utilised to pay for endpoint assessment and can be used for things like registration costs if there is a mandatory qualification within the standard. What it can't be used for is apprenticeship wages, apprentices' travel, any sort of admin costs. I mentioned before one of the companies has a coordinator that's dedicated to apprenticeships in the organisation. That can't be covered. Any sort of managerial costs relating to it. Anything like work placements, again, can't be utilised. There's a significant list within the funding rules which may be useful. If you're looking at becoming an employer provider, you can get them on the gov.uk site. Okay, and then just one other question around the cost of apprenticeships. So just to mention the funding bands again, which I raised earlier on. Funding bands range from £2,500 to £27,000, and those are based on really sort of the complexities of the standard as well as the cost of delivery, which gets taken into account. And then I think we're sort of coming to the end. I can't see. Are there any slides available? Yes, absolutely. At the end of the recording, we will be sending out the recorded webinar, as well as the slide packs will come along with that. We'll also be responding to specific questions that I was maybe unable to answer at the time. Okay, so we're going to leave things on for just a minute or two. We'll go on mute just in case there's any other questions that do pop up. Hopefully you found the webinar useful, and please get in touch with us if you need any further information.